Hi, Sumit. Good to see you
Hi.
back.
Yeah. Good to be back.
Welcome to another Unrehearsed Futures. I have lost count of what episode of season 4 this is, but this is the and it's almost the idea of, and this was brought up by my fellow curator Mgeni Matsali in conversation with Amy over here and Mwenya Kabwe, who are both from the University of Cape Town, Mgeni and Mwenya. And we were just thinking about how do we reframe our relationship with the future, where when you say there will be a time when you're changing the very paradigm of of storytelling to we're reframing even like an imagined future, a hopeful future. I just found a lot of optimism in it, and it just took us out of history and into the space ahead of us, I think. In between all of that, we, each of us individual curators, have our own personal quests that we embark on. And mine has really been one about how do we democratize access massively and empowers us to find our common humanity or our stronger community cohesion and all of those things. And last month, I curated a session with Aiva Consuluetse, whose name I find hard to pronounce. She's from democracy. She's from an organization in Europe that studies democracy and the practice of democracy. And she does a lot of work in outside our own comfort zone of theater practitioners to talk about what are these things at scale. And am I here? Am I audible? I keep being lost in between, I'm told. Hello?
We can hear you now. Why don't you
Okay.
switch off your video and
Okay, I will try that. And really today I'm just going to mediate because I asked Akhila and Radha, who are both wonderful theater practitioners, use theater in different community contexts. Both of them have been great proponents of Boal's work, Augusto Boal. And my question is really like, can we take, because I just feel like what Augusto Boal did in the early 80s, in the 80s, right? Basically, or late 70s, early 80s. Yeah.
70s.
70s, yeah. And what he did was really a great example of somewhere bringing democratic participation back into people's hands through theater practices. And I just think that in a world that is changing so rapidly, is there a way we can reimagine or readapt or be informed by those practices and see if we can create a bet, like, I don't know, okay, I'm going to be very global dominating right now, but a solution, create solutions at scale that allow us to empower people the way that yoga has become a movement that is good for individual well-being, development, and growth, both body, mind, and soul. Can theater play this role of like a community-based yoga? Can it become, can we create like our own set of, I think Mwenya had put this question forward, what would be the theater asanas? What would be the Surya Namaskar of theater? And I do feel like, Boal maybe points in answers to this. And Falguni will, of course, put their information up in the chat window. But I think I'd like it if Radha could start with some opening thoughts, maybe about 5 minutes, and then hand it over to Akhila. And then we can see how the conversation grows from there. And I will, of course, interject with my questions as I want to quest about this, about my solutions, which I can see Akhila smiling at because she's threatened to reframe it already, which is fine. We're here for possibilities, whatever possibilities are. So Radha, you can, yes.
Jehan, I couldn't hear the last few seconds of what you were saying. I don't know if the others heard you, but
we hear
I
you.
couldn't hear. So did you have a specific something for me, question or, yeah?
If you can start by maybe 5 minutes of opening remarks on what I have framed so far for you, and then hand it over to Akhila.
Okay. So a couple of things I'll pick up from what Jehan just said. One is, he said, can we have a community-based kind of TO practice? And the other word was humanity. And I think I'm just going to take these together. I was reminded of this conversation last night over dinner that I had with some friends. They were mental health practitioners. One of them is also a gynecologist, currently doing some phenomenal work in Meghalaya, a northeastern state in India. And she was talking about Khasi women from the tribe, Khasi tribe, who some of them have like 10, 12 children and think that that is really what they are meant for, and there's a lot of, there's deaths, there is, really bad health, and they don't even come to the hospital for childbirth, and many of them die in childbirth, and all this is accepted. And she was talking about how she has conversations with them. And I was sitting and listening to her, quite amazed by the absolutely brilliant conversation where, she's not telling them that what they do is wrong or how they're living their life is wrong, but she's gently asking a series of questions. What will happen when? And what do you think you would want your daughter to do, etc., etc. A series of questions which leave them thinking. And this is someone that did TO with us, with CCDC, about 12 years ago. And I was actually asking her, I know that she doesn't practice TO, but I was asking her, about her memory of that workshop. And she said, what I took away from that workshop was that what you do has to be community-led. And I saw that in her description of her work with the Khasi women. And this is really what I think I want to open with, that when we say, can TO really become, a universal, community-wide kind of practice, what I would like to think of is not multipliers that Boal really wanted, definitely we need multipliers, but we also need people who have internalized the spirit, the politics, and the philosophy of TO, and who are using it simply in their lives to be whoever they are in their interactions with people. And I think that then is a movement. It is a movement and this is not very far from what I had visualized for my own practice. When I started CCDC in 2011, I remember thinking and putting this down also in the mission statement, that we want to take TO to as many spaces and as many communities as possible. And we want the language of TO to be there in every school in India. This, and what I mean by the language of TO is really the language of dialogue, where people are listening to each other. And I think that's really what it all boils down to. And I think that's entirely possible. And I really think that this is the time for TO. Just going by the amount of interest that I see, people writing to us, reaching out to us. Yeah, I think there is a lot of interest in TO, and I think young people today are really looking for a way to be connected to people and for a purpose, in life. And I think, therefore, I do not know of a pedagogy that is more brilliant, more efficient, and definitely more democratic. Yeah, maybe I can say more when, later.
Okay. Radha needs to pick up her phone for us to be audible. So I'm waiting for her to do that. Great. Akhila, we'll hand over to you. We're having a little bit of technical difficulty with Radha's audio. So she's porting in on her phone to listen to us via her phone. Thank you for that, Radha.
Okay, Radha, you can hear me, right? You can strike an image if you can hear me.
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Yeah, it also speaks to the larger power dynamics of the like technology world that mirrors the larger world. Some of us have access, others don't. But I really appreciated, Radha, what you just said. And hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody who's here on this call. My name is Akhila. I'm calling in from New York City right now. It's 6:30 in the morning here. So I'm a little bit groggy, but I'm here. Just for some context, my theater of the oppressed practice is currently in an adult psychiatry setting. I work with patients and I work actively with like doctors as well. So I really appreciate Radha kind of bringing in the concept of community mental health actually happening, because I'm going to use kind of that idea of how TO is adapting to its times right now by really centering trauma-informed therapeutic practices within the politics of the pedagogy in itself. But I do feel like before we go a little bit into imagining and reimagining Boal for the future, it might be important to just harken back to Jehan, what you said about what is the history of TO. Why did it start in the first place? And while we might understand it as people who have been doing TO, I'm not sure that members of our audience like have that context. So we'll just speak very briefly about the history of TO, just so that we're all on the same page. And I feel like it's important to refer to history because history, as we know, repeats patterns of oppression as well as patterns of freedom. So it's almost like having data to look at so that we can start imagining possibilities. So TO was started between 1950s and in the 1970s, and it was started in response to an extremely authoritarian military a very military coup back in Brazil. And at that time there was a lot of artistic repression and as well as media censorship. And the people in Brazil, this includes your peasants and your workers, didn't had to find a way of speaking up against the government without getting completely shut down. So theater of the oppressed evolved as a kind of an aesthetically distant, politically subliminal way of fighting up and speaking against the government without getting censored. So it's in that kind of titrated space. So that's where it emerged. Secondly, it emerged because the peasants and farmers realized that what they're fighting for, which is the right for food, the right for housing, the right for land, these are collective and social issues. None of these issues are an individual's problem. So there was a need for a theater that could make an individual's problem a collective solution. So theater of the oppressed emerged from these two contexts. So you have this desire for social action, and B, there's a desire to make fun of the government, a desire to make fun of this very, very highly authoritarian regime. So TO, like the mechanics of a TO game is actually to bring in catharsis, to bring in humor, to make fun of these people who don't give us any rights. So the idea of a psychological and a political revolutionary was part of the ethos of TO. as TO has evolved over the times, we have begun to look at politics and therapy as separate, as two bifurcated aesthetics. But actually, in its historical context, the psychological and the social was so rooted. The peasants and the farmers were so there was a sense of a release that happened when they like performed their plays. So now going back to what Jehan's asking us to do, which is brainstorming TO for the current context, I absolutely agree with Radha that rather than looking at like what were the skills that your friend exhibited in that moment while she was talking to the women in the like tribal region. Yes, like you said, it was this like gentle questioning, right? In counseling we call it motivational interviewing, this idea of being able to listen to somebody else's truth and being able to challenge them a little bit further. That's the skill of a joker. What you're describing is somebody who's a joker in the like theater of the oppressed context. So I feel like in my kind of closing and opening remarks of this, I'll just say, rather than thinking about how we can spread TO, if we can actually think about how can we spread the skills of a TO practitioner and make that more global, which includes exactly what Radha was describing the woman did, being able to coexist between two opposite realities at the same time. So when I'm listening to a patient at work, or when a joker is mediating a forum theater, can they sit with the anxiety of somebody else's otherness and also hold their moral truths at the same time? And for me, that's what theater of the oppressed does. And if we can think about as theater practitioners, how do we share that muscle rather than necessarily a theater of the oppressed game in itself? I mean, TO is one way of doing it, right? But I know that we have like Radhika Jain here, who's a fantastic playback theater artist. Playback theater also does that. Psychodrama also does that. So if we can think less about the technique and more about what are the prerequisite kind of skills that are being required for this technique, because that's what's the real empowering glitch in this. Yeah. Back to you, Jehan.
So great. Radha, you heard all that? Perfect. Now we're going to keep checking in on Radha's audio situation. I think that questions. One is, yes, I just wondered if... Yes. Oh, sorry. Continue, Radha.
Yeah. Can I quickly say something?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yes, go ahead, Radha. Go ahead, Radha.
Can I quickly say something here? Maybe you can just, yeah, okay. So thank you, Akhila, for kind of giving that context. I was actually going to introduce myself and CCTC at the work and everything, but I think with all this confusion with the audio not working, I forgot all that and directly responded to Jehan's question about, TO today. So I'm glad you spoke about that context. And when we try and reimagine that for today's context, one of the things that has not changed, and this is really what remains brilliant, at the heart of TO, I think are certain things that really are not time specific, or context specific. And a lot of people, sort of worry a little bit about this dichotomy in TO between the oppressed and the oppressor, right? But something that Boal said, that Freire says, which, Bell Hooks also speaks about in her teaching community books. And something that I think all of us need to remember is that while it evolved as a practice against something, right? What Boal constantly speaks about, again inspired by Freire, is while it's important to be sharply aware of differences, it's also important to be aware of the humanity of the other, so that dialogue continues, so that we continue to engage. So it's not about not engaging with the oppressor, right? It's always about engaging and recognizing the humanity of the oppressor. And I think that's what we desperately need today, because what we do not have are, decent conversations, the reasonable dialogue, between people that are willing to listen to each other. There's so much polarization. And even among people who are working in the development sector, even within NGOs, I mean, we have such a hard time coming together allyship is so hard. And I think this is why I think TO is so important today, because it addresses that. Every single game in Boal is about navigating difference, is about navigating constant change, developing suppleness, agility, flexibility. And those are the muscles that we need for democracy today. Yeah. Sorry, Jehan. Yeah, I'm sure you have questions for us.
Also, for context, like Radha and I just talk about this and banter about this for a long time. So we're also kind of used to going back and forth with each other. But I'll just say, just respond. Radha, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I really appreciated the use of the word allyship, which you used, because in the recent book that Julian Boal has written, which I highly encourage everybody here to read, it's called Theatre of the Oppressed and Its Times. It came out in the Rutledge copy about a month ago. It speaks about TO's, the forum theatre dramaturgy evolving into an allyship model, which is something I know that Radha, you and I have spoken about, which is that earlier in the original form of forum, it was the protagonist versus an antagonist, and various interventions would come in to try to replace the protagonist to have a more a more systematic solution to their conversation with the antagonist. But the current model of forum, which is what Julian Boal writes about, is exactly the allyship model, which is not a protagonist having a conversation with an antagonist, but really a protagonist having a conversation with what he calls a potential ally. And a potential ally is that person who has that submissive part of themselves that doesn't really want to help, but also that subversive parts of subversive part of themselves that they want to challenge what's happening. So they see the humanity in the protagonist, they want to help this protagonist, but at the same time they can't because of a larger systematic reason. So there we're really encouraging spectators to think about this idea of how do you love somebody when you morally disagree with them at the same time? How do we have the capacity to tolerate someone else's frustration while also empathizing with their humanity? And I find that allyship model to be an extremely futuristic way of looking about TO, of thinking about TO with communities.
I feel like I want to jump in.
Can I respond to that?
Nope. Yes. Okay. I had a feeling I would be mediating this conversation and not provoking it. So go for it.
My phone keeps saying reconnecting. So yeah, I think I will just look for thumbs up and yeah. No, there's something I want to sort of just caution people about. While it's true that allyship is important to remember and to work with and to see people not as the other, but also as the other, but we need to engage with the other. But I think recognizing that there is oppression is extremely important, because it also makes people uncomfortable. So we have, especially when we are working with privileged communities, privileged groups, I think this comes up all the time. A tendency to sort of not want to look at it as oppression, but as someone who is unable to sort of come out of their own struggle, and etc., etc. I just wanted to put in that as a word of caution. It's important. That is the politics of the work. It's important to acknowledge that there is oppression, but it's also important to talk about the need to engage, and the need to engage with love. In fact, I think what Freire says in The Pedagogy of Hope is important. Without rage and love, there can be no hope. And I really believe that the rage is important, but also the love. Yeah.
Kind of. Can you hear us? Okay, hear us. Fine.
you're having audio issues, the advice to switch off your camera was a good one.
Yes, I'm going to do that again. So your phone is connected to Wi-Fi. Okay, I'm just telling Radha to connect her phone to Wi-Fi. Okay. And I will see if I can type this question in to Radha as well as we go, because I also know that we are tight on time with Akhila. So let's go into this. So one of these things is, yeah, I totally understand that it's not just about seeing if there's a way of disseminating the tools. I think that for it to be movement like propagation, you would have to imagine that the thing that is taught or the thing that is shared, the tool or the method that is shared, is so easy to pick up, or so easy to, not easy, I suppose, but accessible and also transmittable. So once somebody has played and conducted themselves in a certain level of exercises, either be it TO or playback or whatever, they can continue to perpetuate that. But that leaves this big gap. I'm going to just ask all these questions in one go and shut up, because I can imagine the two of you will just hold fort very well. And I do get that the multipliers have to have a sensibility or an internal capacity. So it's almost like, and I'm going to mix this up. And you also spoke about how that it was the attractiveness of TO, or the attractiveness of that work at the time when it was first being born, was this opportunity to make fun of and enjoy yourself whilst doing it. And this reconnection of the political and the psychological. And I wonder somewhere if that is, and I'm putting that on the side for my own notes as could this be a hook? Could this be the attractor, the sort of gateway drug to total participation, is how I'm thinking of it. But so one is, I don't know, how does one propagate the sensibility of a TO practitioner or of a multiplier of future jokers, versus how does one, because that is as important, but you want that to also, or do we have to always create social engineers who go off and then teach others, but the others will never be able to do the social engineering themselves? I mean, it's supposed to be community led, so I can't imagine that that's not possible, is my first sort of thought. And the second is, TO has a specific sort of spirit. There's an internalized spirit, you said, Boal, where you're aligned with the spirit of TO, and there's a politics of TO. And I'm just thinking that in context of the system of where current political thought has taken us, what current political thought has done to both our individual psychology and our ability to, our inability to participate politically. If the current system is so antithetical to what we are hoping to propagate, how do we fight against that? Is it 10 times harder now than it was in the 1950s? Or is it just another time for the same universal truths to find a way through? That was everything I had in the bag, because I want you guys to go at it. So who'd like to go first? And also people on the chat listening in, just keep typing in. Ayush is typing, Amy is typing, whatever you have, and we will just, I'm sure Akhila and Radha will read those and fold them into their conversation. Akhila, would you like to start with you?
Cool. Also, so good to see you, Ayush, and read your comments. We worked together before, so good to see you, Ayush. So the first question, I got the first and the third question, which I will respond to, and I'll try to wrap Ayush's question with it. So how does one propagate the sensibility of TO? I will say that in India, at least, and also all over the world, the TO is already propagated. I think it's important to ask who is asking this question, and who is being visible, who's asking this question, right? Because, for example, if you look at particular parts of Gujarat, for example, there's a huge TO movement where they're using TO very actively to work against casteist oppressions. There's a fantastic theater company called Whistleblower Theater Company that has been doing this work for years. Similarly, in parts of Uttarakhand and in parts of the
Say the
Northeast,
name of that company again.
it's called Whistleblower Theater, and the TO practitioner is Maulik Raj Srimali. So they have been doing TO. So I think it's important to ask again, right? The fact that Radha and I are on this panel also speaks to the fact that probably we are people who've been writing about this work and like whose work is visible, but this work has actually been like propagated for a long time. And I'll go back to when I went to study with Julian Boal's theater company back in Brazil. I learned there that the landless workers movement, which is where TO initially started, for them, TO is their every day. It's their like blood, sweat, and tears. It's also, if you ask any person who's involved in like the landless workers movement, for them, they'll say, yeah, TO is propagated. So again, I think it's important to ask ourselves who is asking this question and like who is giving the answer. In terms of how does one propagate the sensibility, the solution answer, Jihan, that I feel like you may be looking for maybe is how as theater practitioners, can we expose ourselves to the anxiety of somebody else's otherness in that everyday practice? That's, I think, what makes successful TO practitioners. So how often do we get to sit in someone else's story and like Radha said, let our bodies experience the rage and the love and sit with it? How can we just sit with it, slow down the mechanics of TO before like instead of acting and speaking up and intervening, how can we just sit with that discomfort? That skill of sitting with it, I think, is a great way of propagating the sensibility. The third question, which you said that TO has a spirit, and how are we, and like given the political times, how are we targeting it? I will say again that the allyship model is a direct answer to this question, because they are realizing that the world is becoming a lot more censored, and there's actually higher stakes for speaking up. How do we do it? Also, it depends on where we're speaking up. If I'm speaking up in an American context versus the Indian context, what does that look like? And I think if we think about forum theater as a metaphor, right? An image theater game as a metaphor, how can we use metaphors to create a little bit of that aesthetic distance, which allows us to talk about our politics? So I feel like Theatre of the Oppressed already has those mechanics, already has those muscles built into the process, which is using the idea of metaphor, using the idea of humor to speak up. And also, where do we choose to perform? So usually forum theater was performed for people who, like people from the community who already had that anger and rage in them. So the safety parameters are already, in some sense, pretty much there, where they can already relate to the protagonist. And Ayush's question, I absolutely agree that asking people to humanize the antagonist can be very tricky in that way, but that's why the allyship model does not actually have the oppressor in the forum. It's just the protagonist talking to the potential ally. And what we're showing through that is that the system is oppressive because of us, because of all of these potential allies. Right now there are all of these protests happening in the city about, the like genocide in like Palestine, and there are people who are strongly on the street saying, "Come on, let's protest." But then there are actually Palestinian immigrants themselves who say, "I want to see a free Palestine, but I don't want to get my visa status taken away by like going to this protest." So you're really showing all of us have these contradictions within us. And the allyship model shows that, rather than talking about the antagonist. The antagonist doesn't matter. We know that the oppression exists. If we show the oppression, we are just reinforcing it. How can we bring highlight to the systems and the allies, all of us who are actually part of that system? Yeah, I'll shut up there. Pass it to Radha.
Radha, we lost you for a second, but I think you're back. Nope. Oh, it's getting worse. She was here.
Yeah. I'm really sorry. I don't know. My phone also doesn't seem to be perfect here. So I missed a lot of what you said, Akhila, but yeah, I think there's quite a lot to sort of think about here. And in response to what Jahan's questions were, and also, continuing from what you said about building the sensibilities, I won't speak about it, but I will just speak about a couple of things that CCDC is doing. And to me, it seems like, we learned a lot from these, and maybe that is one of the ways that we can think of. One is in the last 2 or 3 years, CCDC has come up with, or rather Ravi, who's here and who is the other facilitator with CCDC, has come up with, is a model of training that is slightly different from what we used to offer before. So we would be invited by NGOs to come and work with their communities. Instead, we suggested that we work with the staff of the NGO, who then could work with the community, so that one, the work is sustained, and also the work is far more effective because the staff know the community. They are sometimes embedded in the community themselves, or are more familiar with the local context, right? So what we now do is offer a 6-day training similar to the one that we offer in Bangalore, which is an open training, but this training would be only for the staff from the NGO. And we follow it with mentorship, continued mentorship for as long as the NGO wants it. And this mentorship takes 2 forms. We go on site and observe and give feedback for facilitation by the staff in the community. And we follow it with online meetings where a lot of really nice things happen. One, they've started facilitating, they have doubts, and they clarify those doubts about what to do if, what to do when, etc., etc. But also they have doubts about the theory. And this is where, we are able to kind of offer clarification from, going back to how the practice began, and also looking at what is the current need in the community and how can TOB maybe adapted. And we keep in mind what Boal says about creative heresies, when we adapt, what is an adaptation that is justified as a response to the community need, and that it ultimately serves the need of the community. That is the only yardstick that Boal really, says is important. And the other things, where you're doing something because it's easier for you, or because you want to sort of say something as a joker, as a facilitator, that would not be acceptable. So these kind of things get clarified in the mentorship conversations with the NGO. And we found that this is one of the ways in which, a training followed by this kind of continued talking, discussions, conversations, both about the theory and the practice. A lot of conversations are about the ethics of the practice. So all this comes up, and I think this is one way to ensure that these are conversations. These are not really where CCDC doesn't lay down the law saying this is how it needs to be done, but we are listening to what is emerging from the ground, and we are learning as much as the NGO staff is learning about the practice. That is one. The other thing I wanted to quickly talk about is a conference that CCDC is currently organizing, in the sense that it's a year-long conference. It began in February this year. And the idea came to me when I started thinking about how do we celebrate 10 years of CCDC. CCDC became 10 years old in the pandemic, during the pandemic, and we postponed the celebration. But then it also gave us this new idea. What does TO look like today? Post-pandemic, new challenges, lots of people's lives were turned upside down. And lots of us found ourselves in situations that demanded a fresh imagination. Whether you were in education or whether you were in mental health, there were just lots of new challenges. And we wanted to see whether TO, how TO could respond to these new challenges. And so we sent out an invitation to the BJ community, the Bangalore Joker community. There's more than 300, 350 of them that have trained with us in the last 10 years or so. And about 25 responded. We met in February. We reconnected with TO through 2 games and exercises. And then we had 2 days of a conference where we looked at projects that we now want to do. So people were already, so these were people from different parts of India, and they were already working in some communities, or some had a desire to start a project but didn't know quite how to. So there were people at very, very different levels of both TO practice, experience, and community experience with community work. And all of us sat together in a room, shared experiences, and came up with project ideas that evolved over 2 days of talking. And these were projects with very, very diverse communities in different parts of India. And these projects are now happening. So people are working on their projects now. And we plan to meet in February 2024 to share our learning. So the idea is that we meet maybe, a little before February, maybe in December or so. We meet all the project leaders and share our learning. Just see where we are and what were the challenges and how did TO really rise to meet these new challenges. And maybe when we have shared our learning, there would be something to present at the conference. All this is still, in the idea stages, but this is something that we're excited about, because what might emerge is an idea of TO across India, with very diverse communities. The projects are very, very different. Some in mental health, some in medical humanities, some in, working with children, and some which are working, working with youth in conflict with the law. Lots of very, very different projects. So I think people would be doing a lot of experimentation with TO, and it'll be interesting to see what emerges at the end of, these months of work. This, we believe, will be more interesting also to look at than what people already did, before the pandemic. That was a different world. It really seems like it was a different world. So I'm kind of looking forward to this learning. And in the meantime, while people are working, we also meet online to check in, to talk about challenges, to kind of just support each other. Yeah, I think that's it.
One comment to Radha's point. I know he's on mute, so maybe this is where I can take my power. Okay. Radha, I really appreciate the kind of variegated efforts that CCDC is doing, and just like, people who are already embedded in the community, having a space where they can check in with you and then activate those projects. I think that's a very kind of interesting way of continuing to let TO adapt times. I feel like here, I also want to mention a story. I don't know if people are aware of this, but Augusto Boal writes about this story a lot when he does community-based work. And I want to tell the story because I feel like it's highly related to the conversation we're having right now. So when TO began in the 1960s, 1970s, Augusto Boal and his troupe of TO actors and like artists would go into communities and would do forum theater plays with them, for them, train them in the TO skills, and then kind of exit out. So in one particular story, he says that he went into a kind of a peasant movement agricultural space, and his actors and him did a forum theater trying to liberate the peasants from their landowners. And the last scene of the forum theater play ended with all the TO actors holding toy guns, ready to go out for a revolution against the landowners. The peasants are watching this and they're getting extremely riled up, and they're like, oh my God, this technique is amazing. We're going to use this technique. And as soon as the forum theater stops, they like get up as like spectators. They have actual guns with them, and they say, you know what, Augusto Boal, thank you for this, theater that you've like shown us. We're going to go out and now shoot our landowners. Are you going to join us? Are you going to join us? And in that moment, Augusto Boal says, no, I'm holding toy guns. My actors are holding toy guns. But the peasants say, no, but we're holding actual guns. Like, let's go and shoot our landowners. And in that moment, Augusto Boal speaks about something really important, is that he realized that he's not from the community. He's an artist. He's an actor. He's somebody who doesn't live the everyday realities, the embodied poetics and the embodied realities of the peasants. And dealing with that contradiction within himself made him convert this idea of the oppressor and the oppressed to really focusing on allyship, which is essentially what CCDC is also doing with their model. So I just want to want us all to go back to that idea of what would Augusto Boal have been sitting with, and how many times have we felt that eternal conflict in all of our work that we are doing, because we're going into communities doing this work. How often have we had to feel with that disembodied conflict, and what do we do with that? Where does it get channeled? And do we allow ourselves to make mistakes? Because we will make mistakes. We are going to be oppressive. We are going to sometimes reinforce the trauma as well. And how do we give ourselves the space for that in this work?
Akhila, you're still with us? I mean, Radha, you're still with us, audible?
Yep.
Awesome.
More important is I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this story that Boal tells of the birth of Tio, until then he was doing regular theater, political theater, but not Tio. When he talks about the birth of Tio and the shame that he felt at that question, and then he says, solidarity means running the same risks. I told the story at a workshop recently of a group of people, mostly privileged. And there was a moment of complete silence in the room. And then lots of heads nodded. And these were all people engaged in what they consider projects of creating social transformation or change, well-meaning people. And, they, at the end of this, after some reflection, some of them spoke up and said, we need to work on ourselves first. So, sometimes, this Boal story or the games, for example, create that, they manage to create this one aha moment, just that tiny shift. It may not work like magic. It's easy for people to get out of that room after the workshop and completely for this experience to fade away. But if it is possible for us to continue to reinforce this kind of experience with more workshops, and this group, for example, felt the power of Tio in that room at that moment when I told the story. And 24 people from that organization have signed up for a training with CCTC in February. So this was a group of truly well-meaning people. There's no doubt about that. And they recognized they were in deep discomfort, but they are willing to take a step from there, very boldly to, more discomfort maybe, but more knowledge. I mean, they recognize this as knowledge. They recognize this as insight. And they really want to understand. So it's possible that this happens. But I want to say that, Ayush is here, and Ayush is one of the BJs that I'm just so happy that he came into our lives. And, we kind of met during the pandemic in an online training that I did. I sort of hated the idea of offering anything or any kind of TO online. I just did this kind of, introduction to TO kind of thing. And that's how we met. And Ayush has stayed a solid friend. And when I say that he's a solid friend, I mean he asks difficult questions and makes us stay on point. And this is what happens in our meetings. We have people like Ayush who ask the right questions, who are not afraid to ask the right questions. And that is so important to build community, to sort of strengthen one's understanding of the practice, and to stay rigorous in one's practice. I think, it's so easy to feel isolated. It's also easy to get complacent in the practice. And I think it's important for the community to stay together, to ask questions of each other and to support each other,
Do we have time for two more questions that I want to thrust out. Wonderful. And also do keep looking in the
There's so much in the
I
chat
know,
box.
but it's good. I mean, by the way, Amy's organization is called Embodied Poetics.
I know. That was a
Yeah.
reference.
So lovely. I think that one of the things that I witnessed, because I'd asked Radha to come and do a TO sort of demonstration of the idea and concept, and Ayush was there, to a group of extremely privileged and powerful people. And I also think about, you know, what Akhila just said about the fact that we have to recognize somewhere that, like, for example, I don't know what's happening in Gujarat. I know Akhila and Radha from just points of privilege and access. I am definitely in my own position just by default an oppressor in other contexts, for example. And so how does one, like, I keep thinking of Martin Luther King. He writes from letters from Alabama, from an Alabama prison. He writes, basically, privilege is never given. It's always taken. You have to step up and you have to just take it. And I can see how hard or discomforting it is, or, you know, how almost it's not the norm for anyone to give up their privilege or give up their power, obviously. But so then what happens to the social do-gooder or the person who thinks they're there to make social change, who's still speaking from power, great positions of privilege, because they do have power and agency to at least enable, if anything else, or to at least catalyze. Maybe it's not, for example, if I think about me and personally, I'm like, maybe it's not my journey to make TO accessible to the entire country, but maybe I can do something to facilitate those who want to make it accessible. And those who want to make it accessible are the true, I don't know, they're the legitimate authors, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word, but how do we deal with this thing of trying to help from a position of privilege, or trying to work from a position of privilege to do the thing that needs doing?
Very good question, Jehan. Very tough question, which you articulated really well, because you're speaking in the Boalian language of literally naming the contradiction. I will say the hidden character in your question is also finances, right? A lot of these theater of the oppressed companies, the fact that we don't know of them is also because there's a severe lack of funding. It's such an unregulated sector that that we need, for me, I feel where we as privileged people can really support this idea is thinking about how can we create more non-governmental financial bodies that can really support theater of the oppressed practitioners to do the work that they're already doing. Because, I mean, let's call a spade a spade. Even at the ETP in Rio de Janeiro, they call themselves privileged. They are not living the same realities as the communities that they are working with, but they have so smartly positioned themselves. And this is what I call smart. It's called smart allyship. They've so smartly positioned themselves where they are able to find funding bodies from educational institutes and whatnot, and trust that the TO practitioners within the community who are doing the work are going to make the movement grow. And I think where we can come in is really looking at creating a sustainable model of funding, creating a sustainable model of researching outcomes of TO, empowering TO practitioners to also become researchers. I think that's something, that's a gap that I see missing, because there's not enough work, or like, and also research can look different, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be an academic paper. It can be how are we kind of measuring the outcomes of this work within a community? And sometimes the outcome is the community itself. So how do we shed light on that? So Sumit, I'm seeing your message, and oh, we should be in touch, because we'll talk. But this is what I mean: collaborations like this, partnerships like this, where we can specifically increase funding for TO-based movement happening on ground and make it a sustainable space. Is one idea. Put it out there.
Yeah, so CCDC has not been very smart about raising funds for our work, etc. We've somehow not, we're a not-for-profit, and we've kind of managed without external funding, because mostly we get invited to do the work that we do and we've managed like that. So I won't really talk about that part of what Akhila was saying. Oh God, there was something that I wanted to say. I think went out of my head. Akhila, can you just repeat your first sentence? No. How do we? Yeah. So yeah. No. I think what I wanted to respond to was Jahan's anxiety about privilege. I think while it's good to be aware of privilege, I don't think we should let that cripple us or freeze us into not doing. I think that's important. This is something I'm saying from personal experience of grappling with, being a privileged person in India. I think there is, it is good to remember that. And I don't want to assume that everyone here is privileged, although we are privileged in the sense that, like Akhila said, we have access to the net. So in India, definitely that's privilege, yeah. But I don't want to assume that we are all the same. And I know that many of us are grappling with the lack of privilege in so many areas of our life. So I think it's important to sort of learn to work with the privilege. And I don't mean use it only to help other people, but I think use it also to help oneself, because privilege is a trap. And I think when we start recognizing that we need to be liberated ourselves also, this is something that Ayush might actually be able to address better. Ayush, do you want to come in at this point and speak? Or, yeah, I might actually just mangle this whole idea. Yeah.
So I was literally going to say, this is the point where I'd love to put the recording off and say thank you to all of you formally